Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Scholar-to-Scholar conversation. I'm Matthew Booker, Vice President for Scholarly Programs at the National Humanities Center, and your host for this event. Good afternoon, everyone. Before we get started, I want to remind everyone that you'll need to log in to participate in the discussion. You can do that by clicking on the blue Sign In button in the upper right-hand corner of your screen using a Gmail account. This afternoon's topic is the price of injustice, and we've invited 3 of this year's fellows to discuss the toll that's been exacted on individuals and communities by anti-Black racism and structural inequalities in policing, education, business, and elsewhere in our society. I'm going to briefly introduce all 3 panelists before they each take a few moments to share some opening thoughts. Then we'll proceed to what I hope will be a lively conversation among our scholars and you, our audience. Please feel free to ask questions or share your thoughts in the discussion section. We'll be monitoring that part of the conversation and bring your questions to the panelists. Our first guest today is Brandi Brimmer, Associate Professor of History at Spelman College. After receiving a BA cum laude from Spelman, Brandi earned her PhD in history from the University of California at Los Angeles, and prior to joining the history faculty at Spelman, she taught at Vanderbilt and Morgan State University. Brandi's work on the regimes of slavery and emancipation in 19th century America focuses particularly on the ways that Black people have asserted themselves in legal systems and within government agencies. Her first book, Claiming Union Widowhood, Race, Respectability, and Poverty in the Post-Emancipation South, chronicles the struggle of Black women who sought widows' benefits from the United States government after their husbands died fighting for the Union Army during the Civil War. Her current project expands on this earlier work by analyzing the work of attorneys and claims agents who represented disabled Black veterans and widows with the U.S. Pension Bureau. Crystal Sanders is Associate Professor of History at the Pennsylvania State University. Professor Sanders received her BA in History and Public Policy from Duke University and did her PhD in History from Northwestern University, where her dissertation won the C. Van Woodward Prize for the best dissertation in Southern history. She is the author of the award-winning book, A Chance for Change, Head Start and Mississippi's Black Freedom Struggle, and her scholarship can also be found in the Journal of African American History, the Journal of Southern History, the North Carolina Historical Review, and the History of Education Quarterly. She is currently completing a book on Black Southerners' efforts to secure graduate education during the era of legal segregation. Our final presenter, Adriane Lentz-Smith, is Associate Professor of History and African American Studies at Duke University, where she researches and writes about African Americans' entanglements with U.S. power in the long 20th century. Her first book, Freedom Struggles, African Americans and World War I, narrates how the experiences of Black U.S. soldiers in the First World War inspired them to imagine a world beyond Jim Crow. As an Organization of American Historians distinguished lecturer, Adriane's work has been featured in documentaries like The Jazz Ambassadors and The Great War, as part of an exhibition for the Library of Congress, and on various podcasts and radio programs. Her current project traces the devastating aftermath of one young man's encounter with the police in 1980's San Diego to explore how state violence and white supremacy reconstituted each other in response to the civil rights gains of the 1960s. Adriane holds a BA in history from Harvard-Radcliffe and a PhD in history from Yale University. Welcome to each of you, and thank you for joining us for today's event. We'll start with Brandi offering a few remarks, then Crystal, and finally Adriane before we open the floor to some of the audience's questions. Brandi?
Thank you. And thank you for the generous introduction. And it's really a treat to present today with 2 colleagues, but historians that I admire a great deal. So this is a really real treat for me. I also appreciate the introduction because this project really does stem from my first book, Claiming Union Widowhood, which is forthcoming. And I'm happy to answer questions about that context as well as we move into question and answer. But the current project, The Other Douglas, analyzes the work of pension attorneys and claim agents who represented the petitions of disabled Black veterans and the poor widows of dead Black soldiers to the U.S. Pension Bureau roughly during the late 19th century, and sometimes that stretches into the 20th century. And it's anchored around the life history of the formerly enslaved Frederick C. Douglass, a self-taught community leader who established himself as a successful pension attorney, among many other things, in New Bern, North Carolina in 1879. Now, just a word about claim agent or pension attorney, as I'm using the language here. These were generic terms that Pension Bureau officials used to describe persons who help disabled veterans in dependent families do a number of things: assemble witnesses, affidavits, other evidence, and also persons who corresponded with Bureau officials in Washington, D.C. What's important is that one need not have formal legal training to carry out this work, but they certainly needed to be able to read and write and have a firm understanding of the laws that were constantly changing in the Pension Bureau over the course of the late 19th century. Working on behalf of his clientele, which included his mother, Douglass provided services that went well beyond what the Bureau probably had imagined. At times, he assumed responsibilities that mirrored those of benevolent societies. He provided food, shelter, made small loans and to needy widows and disabled veterans before their stipends arrived. But most importantly, from my perspective, Douglass skillfully translated his predominantly Black clientele's intimate histories, their experiences of enslavement, sexual violence, family separation, and wartime trauma in terms that Bureau officials would recognize as legitimate. And this is a feat that an earlier generation of white claims agents weren't always successful at. And so indeed, Douglass really becomes a conduit through which Black veterans and their families interacted with the federal government. I started collecting materials for this project many years ago at the National Archives. And as I said, the material wasn't necessarily directing me toward Douglass. I was working on another project. But since then, I've been able to identify another 8 licensed Black claims agents who operated in this area and in New Bern in particular. And this is important because I'm really interested in placing Douglass in a community or a legal community of activism during this period. Like Douglass, these men wore many different professional hats, and some were veterans themselves. And also like Douglass, these men practiced law without a law degree. So in analyzing these sources, I've really worked to reconstruct the world that these men created after federal lawmakers opened up the pension system to the formerly enslaved in 1866. And I do this in recognition of the violence of historical erasure, the erasure of the story of poor Black women's battles for pensions, as well as the criminalization of professionals who assisted them along the way. Careful study of Douglass's voluminous record books reveal the expansiveness of his business and, importantly, the legal savvy of his clients. Ordinary Black people, but especially poor Black women, proved themselves astute legal actors who recognized the Pension Bureau as an important arena of activism. So you can see that there's many ways to, from this brief discussion, there are many sort of inroads into this story, not least of which is the tantalizing nature of the subject, the name of the subject, Frederick Douglass. But I'm really devoted to, and yes, I'm interested in his name and sort of thinking about that history and what that means in the context of his pension business. But I'm really devoted to telling a story about Douglass that contextualizes and analyzes the social relations bound up in the claims-making process. For me, that means reconstructing the communal spaces newly freed Black women created and sustained in the aftermath of slavery. It means centering the concerns of poor Black women, just as Douglass did throughout his professional career. And it means contemplating why Douglas continued to take on the cases of women whose lives absolutely challenge pension bureau officials, as well as oftentimes the Black middle class's sensibility about respectability. For example, he represented women who worked outside of the home instead of spending time caring for their disabled husbands. He represented women who live with men while collecting survivors' benefits. So there's a range of different kinds of cases that Douglas takes on during this period and will represent over the course, oftentimes over the lifetime of the case. So I want to end today, my remarks today, at least the opening, by returning to what I think is in part the theme. And that really is sort of thinking about the question, did Douglas pay a price for advocating the cases or advocating on behalf of poor Black people and poor Black women in particular, who fell outside the boundaries of worthy widowhood? The answer to that question is yes. In 1894, pension examiners accused Douglas of falsifying evidence and collecting illegal fees from his clientele. This is a complicated question, and I'm happy to take have more discussion around it. Douglas absolutely did collect additional fees from his clients. Sometimes this was to pay for administrative costs. Sometimes he did expect a little extra pay. And oftentimes his clients who testified in these trials or interviews or testimonies said that they were more than happy to support Douglas in this way. They thought of this as gifts. They appreciated the service that he did on behalf of their community. There are other clients of Douglas's that complained about his services. They felt that he mishandled their cases. They felt that he took too long. So there's a number of reasons why pension examiners turn their lens to scrutinize the work of Douglas, as well as the success that he has on behalf of this community of pensioners. And it's on the basis of this evidence that they do move to permanently suspend, that is, the Pension Bureau permanently suspend Douglas from representing cases within the Pension Bureau. In his defense, Douglas is going to vigorously protest the decision and engage in a fierce letter writing campaign and rallies a cross-section of Blacks and whites across Eastern North Carolina. His networks extend well into Washington, D.C. in terms of his letter writing campaign. But all of this is for naught. He will never regain his license in the Pension Bureau, but he will continue to work below the sort of the lens or the landscape of the Pension Bureau, continuing to write and advise disabled soldiers and poor widows who sought recognition and redress from the federal government. Thank you.
Thank you, Brandi. Crystal, would you like to share with us some opening thoughts?
Sure. And first, Matthew, let me thank you for that gracious introduction. I'm honored to participate in this conversation today with two distinguished historians who I respect greatly. Let me begin by saying that racism is very costly, both literally and figuratively. If we think about racism with respect to healthcare, racist ideas about Black bodies and Black people have led African Americans to receive inadequate preventative care and inferior treatment. We know that many African Americans struggle with poor mental health because of the psychological burden of racism, right? If we think about something like economics, we know that the federal government's refusal to insure mortgages in Black neighborhoods, this practice of redlining, prevented African Americans from being able to accumulate wealth because they were prevented from becoming homeowners. So we know that there are real literal costs to racism or costs to injustice. And as you mentioned in my introduction, I am a scholar of Black educational history. And so my remarks today are really about the cost of racism with respect to inequality for educational opportunities for African Americans. And if we start from really the Reconstruction period, or really the period after Reconstruction, where redeemers or white supremacists take back control of Southern state governments, we begin to see that, the South couldn't afford really one decent school system, yet they embark on creating these dual systems of education that allow or that compel Black and white children to receive very poor educations, with Black students receiving the short end of a short stick, right? The shorter end of a very short stick for all students. If we think about, moving forward in history, if we think about the period of desegregation, we know that many Black teachers and principals lost their jobs as Southern school districts moved to these unitary systems of education. We know that often desegregation is very one-sided, with Black students being made to leave their institutions and go into formerly all-white schools. That's a loss of school tradition. That's a loss of school mascots, school songs, school trophies, school championship records. If we think about it in terms of the social aspect of schooling, especially for high schoolers, we know that Black students lost opportunities to have those social positions like a homecoming queen or a football quarterback as these schools are being made, as Black schools are closing and Black students are forced into white schools. Now, my current book project looks at the obstacles that Black Southerners endured as they pursued graduate and professional school education during the era of legal segregation. And during the era of legal segregation, no Southern state government allowed African Americans to enter these flagship institutions. So right now we're sitting in Durham, North Carolina, miles away from the University of North Carolina, the first public institution in a public university in the country. And if, as a North Carolina resident, I could not have attended the University of North Carolina for a master's degree, a doctorate degree, a JD, or an MD. But what North Carolina did in an effort to perhaps comply with the Plessy decision was to create something that I call segregation scholarships in my work. And by segregation scholarships, what I mean is that North Carolina supplemented the cost for me to go, or for African Americans to go to the North, the Midwest, or the West for graduate study. So the University of Wisconsin or NYU or Columbia or any other Northern institution that admitted Black students, North Carolina would say, well, you go there and we'll pay the differential between the cost of you attending UNC to get your PhD and the cost for you to go to Madison or to go to Chicago to get that PhD. Now, there are many people who would say, oh, that was a good arrangement. Black Southerners had the opportunity to learn at some of the best institutions in the country, whether we're talking about Harvard or NYU or Chicago or Northwestern or Berkeley. But we failed to remember the cost of being forced to leave your the only community you've ever known, the cost of being made to travel very far from your relatives, right? Because for these Black Southerners that are forced to go elsewhere for graduate study, oftentimes, they're being made to leave a state that the only state they've ever known. When they're traveling abroad, as I call it, for graduate study, oftentimes they're doing so without any assistance for their transportation costs. That's an additional burden that they face. They're having to find housing in these urban, unfamiliar areas where if they had been able to stay in the state where they were citizens, they could have lived with family members, lived with people that they knew to cut down on expenses. Also, when we think about this arrangement of exporting Black scholars, we have to think about the fact that even if these Southern states, and I should tell you that 16 states did this, 16 states compelled Black students to go out of state. If these states did not want to desegregate their flagship institutions, they also could have expanded the curricular offerings at the public Black colleges in these states. So that's another area where I think we have to think about the cost of segregation, right? Here in North Carolina has more public HBCUs than any other state in the nation. We have to ask ourselves why it is that North Carolina decided, rather than admit African Americans into the UNC's medical school or put a medical school at North Carolina Central, they paid for Black doctors to go to the University of Michigan, to go to Meharry, to go to a host of medical schools across the country. Those are consequences because number one, it produced an unfair burden on these students. But number two, it lets the underdevelopment of public Black colleges. So we see that another cost of this effort to prevent Black students from getting into these flagship institutions was the underfunding and the underdevelopment of public Black institutions. And so with respect to education, there are numerous ways in which African Americans really bore the brunt or the burden, right, of segregation. We see that, you know, African Americans are taxpayers. They are paying taxes that are upkeeping the medical school, that are upkeeping the pharmacy school, that are allowing white students to become veterinarians and white students to become lawyers and white students to become doctors. And even though it's Black tax dollars contributing to these graduate programs, Black taxpayers are being told you're not welcome and you need to go elsewhere. And so my book really looks at these costs, these forgotten burdens that Black students are being forced or asked to carry. We have to ask ourselves, you know, what is it like to travel while Black before there's an interstate highway system, where these are back roads and you're having to take the train and you're having to take the bus. And when those buses, or if you're coming home, when those buses cross back into the South, having to literally get up and move to the back of a bus, right? The other component of this is, what about the students who, for a variety of reasons, cannot leave home? One of the people I write about is a young man by the name of Paul Jones. He was 24 years old in 1949 when he wants to go to the University of Alabama Law School. For various personal reasons, he could not leave the state of Alabama. And Alabama says, if you don't leave, there's nothing we can do for you. So we have to think about the numerous African Americans who don't reach their highest potential, who are not able to complete their academic aspirations because they don't have the luxury of being able to travel and relocate to another state. Opportunities that they would have had they been opportunities to study that they would have had if they could have remained in the state of their birth, in the state where they were taxpayers. So oftentimes when we look at this, all of the examples of African Americans who cannot reach their highest potential, we also have to think about the lifetime income that is lost from this discrimination in accessing higher education. So not having the opportunity to become a lawyer, not having the opportunity to become a physician, there are tangible consequences that we can trace, right, from not having those opportunities. Also, in terms of the health of African Americans in the South, we have to remember there are only 2 Black medical schools during the era of legal segregation, the medical school at Howard, the medical school at Meharry. Those 2 institutions cannot work miracles. They don't have the space to educate every single African American that desires a medical degree. So we have to think about what type of consequences did that create on the healthcare situation for African Americans in the South. And I can tell you it's dismal. That is why we see such disparate health outcomes between Black and white Southerners throughout the era of legal segregation. These institutions did not have the infrastructure or the ability to send out enough Black doctors to treat and to have professional medical care in Black communities throughout the South. So essentially, I'll just say that there are real, tangible, literal consequences to segregation, especially in the field of education.
Thank you for that, Crystal, for those opening comments. Adriane, would you share with us your opening comments?
Absolutely. And like everybody else, I will say thank you, Matthew, for moderating this, for bringing us together. And I am delighted to be talking alongside 2 people that I don't just respect, I actively like. It's one of the wonderful things about our field and about this community. I too am starting with an answer, or my version of an answer to the question, what has segregation, racism or racial inequality, and state violence or police violence cost us all. And I think no matter how we think about who our we is in answer to that question, my quick, more than half serious answer is that it has cost a lot of our dreams and a piece of our souls. It's easy to understand the answer to that question when we talk about people who have suffered under or actively resisted white supremacy in the United States. But I think it's also incredibly true for folks who have either embraced actively white supremacy, and maybe even more so people who live with it because they don't notice it. Because I think that not noticing it taking for granted others' abasement requires valuing life and dignity a little bit less. That's the kind of unseeing, willful or otherwise, that makes COVID not an emergency until people in communities that think of themselves as white come to realize that viruses don't respect the rules of segregation. It creates a country in which children can be snatched from their desperate parents, separated from them, and lost to them. And we all learn to live with it because the language of law and order, of violating an already cruel law, has been invoked. I think this understanding, right, that kind of the toll of white supremacy is a deadening of feeling, is a takeaway from my origins in studying the Jim Crow era. I'm writing about 1985 now, and I'll get to that, but my first book is really a progressive era or Jim Crow era book. And I recall, even as a graduate student, writing a paper about a spectacle lynching that happened outside of Memphis, Texas, during World War I, and reading an editorial in a Memphis paper that just said, human life in Memphis is cheaper than beefsteak. One of the things that you realize in reading over the long arc, certainly of the 20th century, but before that, for folks who are historians of other periods, is that it's not just Memphis where people have learned to treat human life cheaply. And it's a quote that I come back to and think about a lot as I write or consider other moments in the past, whether it's Emmett Till, kidnapped from his grandfather's home and murdered with no consequences for the murderers in the 1950s, or the baby-faced teenager Kwawan Charles, found dead and mutilated in a Louisiana sugarcane field just a couple of weeks ago. Whether we think about someone like the white Chicago police officer, John Burge, who by his own account of himself trained as a soldier in Vietnam in military, in police interrogation tactics, and then came home to run a major crimes unit that tortured confessions out of accused Black criminals. Or whether we think of Sandra Bland or Breonna Taylor or Ahmaud Arbery or George Floyd or countless other folks who are added to the litany of names who were killed by police or in police custody or by people who took upon themselves the prerogatives of police power. That list extends much longer than the periods I have written about, so before the progressive era, and it will, I suspect, continue after the now that is so deeply on my mind in the present. But the ghosts of many of these people, and in John Burge's case, maybe the ghouls and demons of some of these people, are in my head, have been in my head as I embarked on the project that I am writing right now. It is, as the title suggests, a story of one young man named Sagan Penn, who encountered an egregiously racist police officer in San Diego in 1985. And I'm sort of interested in 1985 in part because it's a moment that's on the cusp of things. It is kind of right before the sort of, it's the beginning of increased policing of the US-Mexico border, and like right before that will be kind of institutionalized in the '86 immigration bill. It is in the midst of an intensification of the Reagan-era war on drugs. And it is as there is a blossoming in California and elsewhere, paranoia, concern, public fascination with the threat of gang violence. Sagan Penn gets caught up in those things in a lot of ways. He's driving in March of 1985, a truck full of friends and neighbors home from an outing in Balboa Park in San Diego, when he's pulled over by a policeman, Donovan Jacobs, on a pretext. Jacobs calls for backup. The encounter quickly becomes violent. Jacobs says because Penn is violent. Penn says that Jacobs escalated. They're witnesses all around, because he pulls actually him into a driveway next to a church. So a bunch of folks from the neighborhood come out of the church to watch the exchange. The policeman starts beating on Penn, but Penn is a brown belt in Taekwondo, so he defends himself from the policeman until the moment that he thinks one of them is going to kill him, at which point he disarms the policeman and shoots them with their own gun, wounding one, killing another, shooting a civilian who is in one of the police cars as a ride-along observer. So it's a story that's profoundly dramatic, and part of this book will be the story of that encounter, the story of the trial, and then there are two trials that come back to back. And if I were to tell it in a kind of classic Hollywood form, it would be one that emphasizes these kind of fantasies of self-defense, right? And of Black masculinity and of Penn able to hold his own. And then it would also stop at the end of either the first trial or the second, when the jury does not convict him, acquits him on many of the charges for shooting and killing the policeman, because his lawyer, who is an incredibly skilled, as he will himself say, an incredibly skilled lawyer, makes a case that the officer who instigated the encounter was beyond the pale racist for even a Southern California police officer in the 1980s. It's a remarkable story in some ways. It's remarkable that he was not convicted. You could imagine it as a story of triumph if you stopped paying attention to his life the moment after he leaves the courtroom for the second time. If you continue to follow that life, if you have any understanding of what moments of violent encounter do, if you have any sense of what people's unwilling entanglements with state violence do, you'd know that there is no triumph ultimately to be had. When we follow Penn's story out, we see a man destroyed by his time in San Diego jails, and then by the vengefulness and retaliation of those folks in San Diego who resented his acquittal in the first place. You see someone who keeps showing up back in the court system, sometimes in criminal court, but then in family court, as his own encounters with state violence transmutate into his enacting domestic violence. You see him unravel in the newspaper. He says at one point in a late interview, "I feel lonely and alone." And then at the age of 40, so 17 years after his initial encounter, you find in the paper an obituary, a report that he's committed suicide, saying that he will never be left alone. So for me, this project is really about the toll that this encounter takes on Penn, but thinking through Penn's life to broader things, thinking about San Diego as place, thinking about the way that any one person's encounter with state violence becomes a family's to endure, becomes a community's to endure, becomes a lesson for others about how they are supposed to or might be able to move through the world. And then in this case specifically, because the outcome is so surprising, right? This is 6 years before Rodney King. It's in kind of the midst of this. I mean, in some ways, it's an outcome that is unimaginable to us now. I suspect, and I say that I won't know what I really think until weeks after I've written what I think, but I suspect that it is our world, it is impossible to imagine precisely because of the reaction to decisions like the one in Penn's case. So part of this book is also about thinking about that, thinking about the cost to us and imagining reforming and indictment, reforming of police practices and indictment of police racism. It's kind of structurally, right? It's a big structural thing, not just as individual actors. And with that, I will hush and let other people talk. Thanks.
Thank you, Adriane, for those comments. And each of you has generated questions from our audience. By the way, you have a fan club in that audience, each of you. But they've also generated questions for me. And the one that I think comes to mind immediately is the way that each of you moved from very powerful individual stories about the ways that individual people in the past suffered from, paid the cost of racial inequality and violence. And you were able to, through your storytelling skills, by recovering those voices from the past, you're able to make real for us something that is also a story we can tell through statistics. And Crystal, for example, you gave us some of the big picture stories about what racism costs, but you tied those to individual stories. And I know you've done that in examples in your talks. For example, in speaking about one of the great founders of the National Humanities Center, John Hope Franklin, who was one of those people who was forced to leave his home state in the South in a kind of forced brain drain, but who returned to give us, in part, this place that you're in. So I guess I would love to hear from each of you, since each of you have done it, how you traverse that difficult scaling between these lives of individuals who are the base of your stories, and yet these larger points you've each made in this lovely way, in this very powerful way, about the actual costs and consequences of racism.
I'll jump in and go first. I'll say that, this project of looking at segregation scholarships involved 16 different states. There were 16 states, all of the states, the former Confederacy, and then border states, that compelled Black scholars to go out of the state for their graduate training. And so as I, began researching the particular policies and procedures of various states, and I began to track some of the recipients, I began to see patterns. So it made it easier to tell a larger story when, for the oral histories that I could find of recipients, a common theme is traveling while Black, of having to be very careful that if you were going to drive, that you made sure you had places to stay before nightfall. If you were taking the train, that you knew exactly what route to take, that you had the monetary resources to get to your destination, and that you had, you had someone to meet you there because you were going to be, disembarking in a strange city that you had never before, been to. And so those common patterns or common concerns among recipients allowed me to kind of go from the, individual stories to kind of larger themes. And so that made it a lot easier. I would also say, archival sources, when the same subjects appear, meaning the same types of issues are coming up, whether I'm writing about Virginia or Oklahoma, Tennessee or Texas, that also makes it easier to tell a larger story. So it really, the archives kind of led me to larger themes.
So one of the things that I love about being a historian is that it accommodates all kinds of brain styles, right? So there actually are people who wouldn't do these projects this way. There are people who would start with big analytical categories and they'd work through those analytical, and they'd give you a history of them and we'd move through that. And for the people who do that well, it would be thrilling, right? I am not one of those people. I'm just not. I think through narrative, I think through character, to the point where when Brandi was talking about Frederick Douglass, I was like, ooh, you could imagine a show like Black Mirror that's like an anthology of the stories that you get through his various cases. Or similarly with Brandi, I sort of perked up as she started kind of giving us people to think through and think about. It's what I do. I think the key is to have this tells you something again about how but to have a conversation with myself about why I find certain things interesting to think through and to think about, right? So with San Diego, in some ways, San Diego as place located, you could define its place in a bunch of different ways, makes it a useful site for thinking about America and America in the world and what that means when you bring those kind of broader currents back into local ground. And Sagan Penn's history, his family history, the people whose lives he touches on carry you out to stories beyond his, right? They carry you into migrant streams. They carry you into the Nation of Islam's encounters with the police, because his grandfather was one of the founders of the mosque there and very important to his life. So it's about, everybody is interesting in some way. Not everybody is going to be useful to think through or to write about. And the key is to find those magical figures who are both compelling and carry some of the work of one's analysis, if that's how your brain works.
Yeah. I would say that I didn't know what I was doing when I started. I really knew that I wanted to. I just was really fascinated with this idea, quite frankly, that was emerging around 1996 about the Personal Responsibility Act and this idea that somehow Black women didn't work, and these sort of debates about welfare. And I continue to sort of trace that back through the welfare rights movement, the civil rights era, early mothers' pension policies, and landed in the Reconstruction era, Civil War era around the Freedmen's Bureau. And I knew that much. And then I through mentorship, a few folks said, well, why don't you look at the Pension Bureau? And so when I did that, I knew I wanted to look at a state in the Upper South, mainly because I was interested. I knew I was interested in poor Black women in particular. I wanted to tell a particular kind of story. And so I just started surveying the soldiers who were recruited in the 35th, 36th, and 37th Regiment. From there, I started to see some patterns like Crystal was talking about. And quite frankly, I thought this story was going to unfold in Wilmington, given what I knew about Wilmington, North Carolina, a robust Black middle class. I really thought that that's where I would see this kind of pension activity. And in fact, that just wasn't the case. And over time, I started to see Douglas's name appear on claims that were coming out of Eastern North Carolina, but particularly Craven County. And then something wonderful happened. And this is for graduate students out there who are applying for fellowships and grants. I always applied for a lot of them. And a gentleman from the North Caroliniana Society wrote back to me and said, there's some stuff at East Carolina University I think you should look at. And it turned out that it was Douglas's pension ledgers. And so that's what, for me, makes this story special. I don't think that Douglas is necessarily unique. I mean, I want to have a lot of fun with his name, et cetera. But for me, the fact that I have his pension ledgers makes him different. But it seems clear to me from the other individuals that I've been able to find that they're engaged in this kind of legal community. And I think this, I'm kind of moving away from your ultimate question, but I think it ties back to some thoughts I was having that both Crystal and Adriane generated. And that is that through bureaucratic racism, in many ways, it has erased this Reconstruction era legal community that poor Black people were on the cutting edge of. And so it was literally through sifting through all of these administrative bureaucratic records that I really didn't have a clue about. I mean, I had some basic categories that I knew I wanted to work with, but I really at that point let the sources speak to me and define sort of where I was going to go. And quite frankly, that's why it took so long. But that was the basis for the kinds of questions I started to ask. Yeah.
We love you for taking your time. Historians are with you. We're starting to get some good questions in the discussion, and so my job as moderator gets tougher. But there's a really many of you said, all three of you said profound things in your comments, and one of those, Adriane, you said, but you might have been speaking for all three of you. You said that racism has cost many of our dreams and a part of our souls, and you gave examples of that, of the way that the deadening of feelings that Americans have accepted now for centuries, the way that has rotted us as a society. You didn't add the rotting part, but I think that's evident. So I want to ask a question that might be a little too personal, but it's one that I think historians like yourselves ought to be acknowledged for. What has it cost you to carry these stories, to bring these stories forward, to be the person, Brandi, who is recovering, for example, Brandi, these stories of immense pain. I mean, people have been robbed and they are seeking redress. These are widows in many of the cases you're describing. Crystal, you're describing people who endured immense difficulties in striving for a dream, and as Adriane put it, many of their dreams didn't come true. So I guess I would just ask you how you carry the trauma of others and the role that you have chosen to bring forward and honor the stories of those people in the past who would otherwise be lost.
Again, I'll tackle this question first, and I'll say, as I said in my opening remarks, and as Matthew, you said in my introduction, I'm a scholar of Black educational history. And I became a scholar of Black educational history to really bear witness to my own family history. Both sides of my family, I came from, Eastern North Carolina communities where education was prioritized. And both of my parents received almost all of their education in segregated schools. And the narratives that I was taught about their schooling was very different than what I learned in textbooks, right? So, you get this narrative of inferior equipment, of, out of date science labs, of just inadequate schooling. And that wasn't what my parents and my grandparents told me at all about their schooling. So I got into Black educational history, trying to make sense of these institutions that were revered in my home, but that are pitied in the classrooms that I was sitting in. And so that's how I began. And so I found it as an honor to kind of tell this story, to give a different narrative, a narrative that I saw as more complete, more inclusive and accurate of these institutions that educated generations of African Americans. And I mentioned that because when we talk about loss, right, and what's lost, and I talked about what was lost in terms of desegregation, my parents were in that first wave of students who desegregated North Carolina's public schools. So when freedom of choice came to North Carolina, my dad became the only little Black Black male eighth grader to go into the white school. And I heard the stories of trauma. I heard how he was treated poorly by some students and by some teachers. Then in his very last year of high school, so after eighth grade, he went back to the all Black school, but mandatory desegregation came to my county, Johnston County, in the 1969-1970 school year. And I mention that because that meant in his senior year of high school, he and his friends, they had to forego the traditions they had looked forward to, right? They had to forego things like their mascot, they had to forego their homecoming songs and homecoming traditions because they're in new institutions. And so one of the reasons that I decided that Black educational history was really going to be my calling, was going to be something that I took on, was to honor that, to honor the experiences of my parents, to honor the experiences of my grandparents, and to complicate how we remember Black education prior to desegregation, right? And so in that regard, I'm trying to really make sense of their experiences. And now with this current project, I'm really trying to help us to see how, number one, we began to get a much larger Black professional and middle class during the era of segregation, and to really make plain some of those obstacles that it took to turn out large numbers of Black physicians, large numbers of Black doctors, even for Black teachers who are trying to increase their salaries that were already less than white teachers. They had to go and get master's degrees, but that means in the summers, they're being forced to go live in New York, right? Or go live in Chicago. And these are the people who go to my churches, right? These are my grandparents' friends. And so again, I'm trying to bear witness to their experiences, bear witness to their struggles as a way of really explaining how we get to today, right? That in 2020, I did not go to a Southern institution for my PhD, there were people who put in that legwork to ensure that one day it would be clear that African Americans had the right and they had the intellectual capabilities to pursue graduate study at UNC or at UGA or at University of Florida. And so this is my way of hopefully bearing witness to all of those, to all of the struggles and all of the burdens that earlier generations carried.
Yeah, I would say when I think about this question, I think about Douglas's case files, and of all the case files I've covered, and he talks about in his records that he represented over 1,500 cases. One comes to mind, and it's a story that I write about quite a bit, and that's the story of Charlotte Banks. She was an enslaved woman who filed for benefits around 1869, and the benefits came through by 1872, and by 1873 she had a pension official at her door saying that you have disqualified yourself because you remarried, publicly escorted her to a bank. She had to withdraw all her money very publicly. And I think about that humiliation. And then I wonder, and she's taken off the pension roll, she's never back on them. And yet she's one of the largest pension files. Her case file is one of the largest that I have, because in 1890, she begins to struggle for recognition again. And in that struggle, she lives till she's roughly until 1912, or at least that's the last time I can track her in the records. It's very clear to me that this is about redressing the memory of her husband, of her family, about the legacy of poverty that she's endured as a result of this. And so because of stories like that, there's times that I've had to press on, because I know that she did, quite frankly. I also, in writing this, I've always been very, very clear, and I've probably never said this publicly, it's never been about me. And that's why it's taken so long. I never wanted it to be about categories that I imposed. I wanted the women to guide me through this. And so I refer back to Charlotte Banks, because she's someone, Louisa Powers, Fannie Whitney, these are characters that show up quite a bit in my work, because they really guided me through the story, and they guided me through struggle. What it means to lose a loved one in the midst of battle, not being able to recover their body or mourn their loss. That is what animated their struggle, and it's what's animated my continuity with this work.
So Crystal and Brandi's responses make me think that I've always been taken with kind of people who on some level are like, you're going to know this about me, right? Whether that's happening in the present or in the past. And especially the people who are making sure that they have some record of their story or themselves when there's no reason to expect that anybody's ever going to see it. So that's part of it. And part of it is this kind of like the people whose attitude in letters or diaries or what have you is, if I could live through this, you can read about it. So that's part of it.
Right.
I also was going to give a glib answer where I said compartmentalization is very useful. But I actually think that on some level, for me, it is until it completely isn't. And so I mentioned in the beginning the L person lynching, where there does get to be a point when you write about them all the time, where you are far more, not sanguine, but sort of able to look, process, talk about it than anyone that you start telling bits of your work to. And that happened with me with that lynching till the moment I hit a picture in, I can't remember which paper, Black newspaper from the 19 teens of his head, just his head in the middle of Beale Street. It was on the microfilm, which I was skimming through, and I hid it in the basement of Sterling Library, and I had to get up and walk out of the room. So there are moments when the feeling breaks through, when you are kind of grateful because it lets you remember that you're still a person in spite of this. And the hardest moment recently for me was in trying to think about and write about Saigon Pen in the middle of this summer, and realizing that I had an anger that was born of knowing more than most people and being furious that people knew so little when these stories have been circulating, people have been testifying about them for so long. And I will give my mother big credit for calming me down, because at one of these moments when I was burbling, I called home and I was like, I'm tired of generosity. I'm tired of teaching people things they should know, of them asking me things that they should know. I'm tired of extending a generosity to people that they will never return back. And my mother was basically like, but you chose this vocation and you are capable of doing it, and you will because it's necessary. And it was one of those moments when I was like, Mama, why do you have to be wise? But she's actually Right. And I think that's the other part of it. It's like, I'm capable of doing it and it needs to be done. And I like writing, and I don't write fiction well. So nonfiction that matters is my bailiwick.
I'd like to point out that each of you turned the camera away from yourself in a sense, and expressed a kind of obligation or duty to others. And I find that striking in historians, and particularly in you, in that sense of duty and a kind of righteous path. We have a number of questions asked in the of our attendees, but we only really probably have time for one more. So I'm going to arbitrarily select one. And the question has to do with Isabel Wilkerson's recent argument that caste is a better way of explaining inequity and injustice in American history than race. And so the question from our attendee is, how have each of you, how has that argument worked for each of you, and how have you processed that in your own work?
So I'm going to set aside, I mean, if we accept caste not necessarily as being exactly what caste is, but borrowing a term to help us get out of the kind of like ruts that we're in using the terminology. So accepting like not quite deliberate, a useful misuse of terminology. Then I'd say, you know, caste is a metaphor that people have been borrowing. You know, they were borrowing it in the 1900s and the 19 teens and 20s also. But that I think the underlying desire, which is to get people away from racism as affect or attitude or perception, and to an understanding of racism, or I usually go back to white supremacy, because I think the system of political economy combined with an ideological understanding is captured, used to be captured in the phrase white supremacy. I'm not sure what's happening to the phraseology right now, but understanding all of the things that we've been talking about for years, the ways in which categories of social difference wrapped around class and race and gender inform and make one another, but that the way that they operate with power and governance in the United States is on some level that they are naturalizing inequalities they are attempting to make seem natural and inherent inequalities that are actually built in and produced by capitalism. It's not to say that that's like a full indictment of capitalism, but that we've been incredibly unrealistic or unfrank about how haves and have-nots work in the system of political economy that we've chosen. And we've hidden behind assertions of certain people's inferiority and deserving of their lower place to justify this thing. That's a kind of circuitous answer, but that's as much as I have for right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is an interesting question. And as Adriane was talking, I was just thinking about how central the question of marriage is in my work, and the idea heterosexual patriarchal marriage is so central in the work, and yet the groups and the people that I write about don't always have the freedom to make those kinds of families, because they're in the midst of transitioning to free labor society. And so even the rituals of family and marriage, poor Black women creatively sort of created systems that made sense to them, but ultimately left them under the lens of surveillance by the federal government. And so, at least in the story that I'm telling. So I think a lot about inequality, probably more so than I would use the language of caste. And I think I'll leave it there. Yeah.
You know, adding on to what Adriane and Brandi have said, when I think of caste, and especially with respect to Wilkerson's book, we're talking about a hierarchy with white people on top, Black people on the bottom, and other ethnic groups in the middle. And with respect to the project that I'm currently working on, that hierarchy really doesn't work. So I don't actually say, when I talk about these flagship institutions, I don't call them predominantly white institutions. I use the term historically white institutions, because all of these flagships that I'm looking at, while they refuse to allow or to admit Black taxpayers, they admitted, students of various ethnicities that were from the United States and from outside of the United States. And I'm not sure that this term caste, that has this hierarchy, would really underscore the anti-Blackness that was inherent in these institutions. So during World War II, we see that the University of South Carolina, the University of Virginia have several Japanese students. So we are at war with Japan, and Japanese students can enter these flagship institutions that are supported by Black tax dollars, but Black Virginians and Black South Carolinians cannot enter these institutions. And I don't think that the language of caste really reflects that arrangement. And so because it doesn't really get to the anti-Blackness that is inherent in the admissions policies of these institutions. So, it's racism pure and simple. Or white supremacy, anti-Blackness, but I don't think caste in particular captures that dynamic.
Or some new word we make up in a week or two here in the center.
Not social scientists, historians here. You don't get to make up new words every week. But that was unfair and unwise. I want to respect your time. And I know that each of you have places to be, people to love, besides this audience that's out here. And so I guess I just wanted to end by asking you if you had any final comments, maybe the question that I didn't ask that you thought I should have asked.
Well, I'll say I've really enjoyed this. This has been a very engaging conversation. I think one of the things that I hope we all remember is that racism exacts costs not just from Black people, but it exacts costs from all of us, including white people. With respect to, this state violence that we're seeing every other day, with wrongful deaths, with illegal stops, with, civil rights violations, that this is costly to all. Not only is it costing Black lives, not only is it changing families as in the communities, as Adriane mentioned, but tax dollars or taxpayers of all races and ethnicities should be outraged, because every time these illegal acts take part, right, with government officials, we see that these municipalities are having to pay out major lawsuits. We should remember that the very costs, right, of this illegal behavior, of this extra legal violence on the hands of law enforcement in particular. I think I saw a statistic that said in 2019 alone, American cities paid out over $300 million to settle lawsuits. And so, I don't think we can put a cost on life, right? And we know that people are dying every day, people who should be alive, but are dying because of this extra legal violence. But all taxpayers need to be concerned, because every dollar that's having to be paid out for these lawsuits are resources that could be used in other areas, of city government.
Well, what I want to say is that I just want to add an end note to what I said before, because I'll go home and regret. I was talking about marriage, heterosexual, patriarchal marriage, but I didn't make the point that what I had hoped to say is that not all people wanted that family formation, and that if in fact and when people and women didn't make those kinds of choices, that didn't make them abnormal or unworthy for benefits. And then I would also say that gender, just to sort of to wrap this up neatly, that ideas about gender and sexuality can work powerfully to enforce ideas about racism and inequality, and that's precisely what happened to poor Black women within the pension system.
And just to add a tiny bit of light, I'll say, we've spent a lot of time talking about the pervasiveness and the tendency to perpetuate of racism and of inequality, of white supremacy. the work of undoing it is slower and it's hard and it's frustrating because you undo and things get remade, but it's necessary and the undoing is possible. And there is something that gives you little pieces of yourself and your soul back when you try. So let's keep trying.
Beautiful thing to say. And it's a reminder, I think, for all of us out here in our viewer land of what a gift it was to have the three of you speak together to one another and to the rest of us. I'm deeply grateful to you for taking this time. I know what else you might be doing with it. And so my thanks and the thanks of everyone out here in this viewing community for your time, Professors Brandi Brimmer, Adriane Lentz-Smith, and Crystal Sanders. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew.
Thank you.
Yeah.